Hi, Misha here, and this is part 4, looking at Federation, Starfleet, starships. Part 1, we looked at the first warp vessels and into the mid-22nd century. Part 2, we went from the founding of the Federation through the age of exploration in the 23rd century, the Constitution class and her sister ships. And in part 3, we began with the Great Experiment, the Excelsior class, and that led into the era, the Golden Age, the Galaxy class period. We ended there with the attack and the destruction of the fleet at Wolf 359. So we pick up today in part 4 with the results, lessons learned. First from the first Borg incursion, then the second Borg incursion, 2373. And then, of course, meeting and then eventually having a war with Dominion, not to mention rising tensions with the Klingon Empire and uncertain times with the Romulans. We'll go through the Dominion War, and then we'll talk about the post-war era, the last quarter century, and we'll end with the end of the 24th century as we roll into the year 2401. So even though we're not covering a lot of time, we have a lot of ship classes to talk about. That'll be the first half of the video, and as always, the second half will be a real point of view from me about the actual designs and models from Eaglemoss, because these are all diecast Eaglemoss models, most from the standard scale, but a few from the larger one. So with no further ado, let's go back to the year 2366 and a little known Lieutenant Commander Benjamin Lafayette Sisko. These are the beginnings of an uprated, more offensively and defensively oriented Starfleet. Like I said, already by 2364, the Romulans were coming out. The Klingon Empire was seemingly stable, but you never know. The Cardassian Wars were only about 10 years in the past. The Ferengi were potentially a threat, but turned out not to be. But the following year, the first encounter with the Borg spurred development forward. And it was felt that there would be 2 to 3 years lead time to develop new weapon systems and new vessels to mount them. So the idea was to start with small vessels, destroyer classes, perhaps like cruisers. They could punch above their weight class, and this would be based around a new, compact, powerful Class 7 warp drive. And these are the two initial designs, one a little more conventional, one a little more radical. And they would essentially be competing designs beginning around the year 2366. And the first of these, the most famous, was the Defiant class, often known as Starfleet's, even the Federation's first dedicated warship, although on paper it was classed as an escort vessel or scientific observation vessel, but that was far from the truth. This was as radical of a design as was possible. With the new powerful warp drive, it had plenty of energy for weapons, shielding, sensors. Almost everything was redesigned in a new standard, and it was a much smaller vessel than we'd really seen before, at about 120 meters overall. 4 main decks with a 5th deck is kind of an engineering pass-through deck, and also partially engulfed the warp drive, which took up 3 decks in a vertical arrangement. It had a standard crew of 40 to 50, although in emergencies it could carry more, and it could operate with fewer, maybe as few as a dozen. In a lot of ways, this was very much inspired by the Klingon bird of prey, and it shows. both in its size, weaponry, and austere accommodations. The 40-some-odd crew would have to bunk together. Each quarters had 2 bunk beds, so you did have a little privacy, but you had to share it. Only the captain had a full room, as it were, which was not much more than a large wardrobe. The largest meeting area on the ship was the mess hall, which could comfortably seat 16 as normal and up to 30 with extra chairs and stuff brought in. No holodecks, small cargo storage bay, a small medical bay, small sick bay, a science lab that also doubled in combat as a reconnaissance sensor room, small shuttle bay, which carried 2 shuttle pods or 1 larger Type 10 shuttle, presumably also escape pods, a pretty well standard bridge, all that good stuff. Of course, it was known as a tough little ship, and indeed it was. For defenses, it had standard shielding, which had quite a bit of power given its small size, but it also had ablative armor, something quite new, which would dissipate energy and also break off if projectiles hit it. Had a recessed bridge for better defense. It did actually have quite decent sensors, but they were combat, tactical oriented. It was reasonably fast, but not designed for very, very high speeds, maximum speed of about warp 9, and cruising around 6 or 7. If you diverted all the power, you could usually squeeze warp 9.4 or warp 9.5 out of it, but usually would have to take some of the weapons offline. And that, of course, gets us to the offensive capabilities. We had a couple of standard phaser arrays, strips. We also had 4 pulse phaser cannon facing forward. We had 4 torpedo bays facing forward and 2 facing rear. And this was the first vessel to be produced with the new quantum torpedo. It could still carry and use photons, but quantum torpedoes use the disruption in space-time to do significant damage in subspace and bypass most shieldings and energy protections, because this was part of the anti-Borg fleet, having so many different phaser types and the ability to punch hard on a single frequency before shifting, and also the ability to deliver up to 4 quantum torpedoes in a volley all at once. The idea was this would be quite easy to mass produce, small, agile, did not risk a huge crew, and they could build enough of these to overwhelm a Borg cube, because at Wolf 359, lining up medium and heavy cruisers in nice little orderly lines to coordinate together did not work well at all. So that was the response. Again, design work began in 2366, but of course, Battle of Wolf 359 would come in 2367, and this was barely under construction. It was first assembled and went for a shakedown cruise in 2368, and at first, it was a complete failure. So it's a good thing they had a backup plan. The Sabre class. This was classed as a destroyer, although maybe a heavy one, and it was somewhat larger than the Defiant class at 190 meters, and had 6 decks as opposed to the Defiant's 4 plus 1. It used a similar compacted warp drive, but it had more room for it, and it wasn't quite as amped up as the Defiant's, more conventional nacelles. And it could operate with the same crew of 40 to 50. A little more space on board. Still quite Spartan, but a little more. And instead of relying on the new pulse phaser cannons, this relied on more traditional phaser arrays. But with most of the armament facing forward, it also had dual torpedo bays facing forward, but it would also use the more conventional photon torpedoes. The latest generation, to be sure, but still photons. And the same goes for armor and shielding. It was more conventional. Didn't have the newest ablative armor. But that conventionality is what made this win out. This too would first have its shakedown cruise in 2368, and it would actually be reasonably successful and ordered into mass production the following year and started to be seen in the field by 2370. Meanwhile, the Defiant was collecting dust. Another reason, aside from the Defiant's propensity for breaking itself apart with too much power, for the Sabre being selected initially, was that it was a more multi-purpose vessel. Yes, it was designed to fight the Borg, and it was designed to be easily mass-produced and require a small crew, and still have quite a bit of weaponry for its size. It also had honest abilities in the science, patrol, exploration, research departments as well. It actually had better, longer-range sensors than the Defiant, more well-rounded, more general purpose, and it had a small shuttle bay facing forward, able to carry 4 pods or 2 of the smaller class shuttles, so a little more bay room inside, also more cargo room, and while it was still too small to have things like a holodeck, it did have at least individual crew quarters for the officers, if not the enlisted. But yes, these were mass-produced and would actually end up being the kind of backbone of the fleet. So this was reasonably successful, and the politics and the funding was there for them. But it was only the first member of what would become known as the anti-Borg fleet. Complementing the Sabre class, and acting a bit as its big brother in fleet roles, was the Steamrunner class. This was considered a light cruiser. It is noticeably larger at about 360 meters, and with a crew of roughly 200. It has a rear swept warp drive, and it is a very compacted design, making it a lower profile target, even though it is a larger vessel. It's very flat. It had roughly 18 decks in total, including the pass-through engineering decks. It had very good phaser coverage, 360 degrees. They were phaser arrays, not cannons, but good coverage. And while it only had 2 photon torpedo launchers, they had extended magazine capacity, so it could fire a lot of torpedoes, making it a bit of a torpedo boat. But it also had a secondary role as a troop transport in combat or in peacetime. These were designed for border patrol, policing actions, kind of to be used like a cutter, similar to the Soyuz we looked at last time, just 100 years more advanced. So yeah, border security, police actions, anti-piracy, and if combat came to be, this would complement the Sabre, kind of coming in there and hanging in, launching multiple torpedoes and using its phaser arrays to cover things. Just a more well-rounded ship, hence the cruiser designator. And it would have a sister design as well, the Norway class. And this is another very flat design. It too is roughly 360 meters long. It too has a crew of roughly 200. But it doesn't have a separate engineering hull. Rather, it uses a warp drive integrated into the saucer module for better defense. And while it does have 2 photon torpedo tubes, it doesn't have the magazine capacity of the Steamrunner. What it does have, though, are phaser cannon, pulse cannons, much like the Defiant, using that technology. Some versions had 6, some had 9. So instead of phaser arrays, we had phaser cannons. This allowed it to act as a artillery ship, a gunboat, as you would, giving it quite a lethal punch to run in, fire its cannons on a certain frequency, do damage to the Borg, and then hopefully sweep back out. It too was classed as a light cruiser. Very similar in a lot of ways to the Steam Runner, but the particulars were a little different. And in a peacetime, this could serve as a large-scale convoy escort or a relatively close-range exploration patrol ship. But it was, much like the Defiant, pretty well combat-oriented. Even has additional armor, although not ablative armor. It was meant to get in and do more scrapping than some of the other vessels in the anti-Borg fleet. One advantage all three of these classes had over the Defiant was in speed. The Defiant's energy was mostly dedicated towards weapons and shielding. Like I said, top speed of about warp 9. These ships could hang in there at about warp 9.6. As we've already discussed in previous videos, that's actually significantly faster. It may not seem like it on paper, but the way the warp scale is calibrated, it's significantly so. The Saber, the Steam Runner, and the Norway are all quite fast vessels for what they are, but then again, they don't have quite the punch of the Defiant, and they don't have quantum torpedoes. And they're all relatively small. So we have kind of 100-ish meter destroyers, and then we have 300-ish meter light cruisers. There is one more to complement them. The Akira class medium cruiser. This is more of a proper multi-purpose starship. At about 500 meters long, it had a crew of roughly 500, but it was very modular, very adaptable. For example, in wartime, this rear pod could be a weapons pod. If it was in more of a patrol duty, it could be a sensor pod. If it was completely peacetime or assistance missions, it could be replaced as a cargo pod. So, much like the Nebula class. That gave it quite a bit of flexibility, but furthermore, it had a total of 3 shuttle bays, one relatively large one in the front, and 2 smaller ones in the back. In combat, this would have advantages, and in peacetime, this would allow for evacuation or just mass people transporting. It still had very good weaponry. It had large photon torpedo reserves with as many as 6 tubes in total. Standard phaser arrays, good for its class again. Good armor, good shielding. Again, it was a well-rounded vessel. And it was even faster than the first 3 in the fleet, although it did come out slightly later in 2369 to 2370 than the rest. It was capable of reaching warp 9.8. Again, incremental increase, yes, but important. So, for a time, you might say the Akira was the fastest type in the fleet. And it did serve as kind of a localized command post, monitoring area, and it would serve as a fleet support ship well into the 25th century. And again, in peacetime, it actually had quite a few purposes. And all of these did. And these did allow older vessels like the Oberth, the Miranda, the Constellation, and others to be replaced. Part of it was aging ships. Part of it was the loss at Wolf 359. New ships were needed anyway. So instead of building 40 or 50 ships to replace the losses there, why not build smaller, smarter ships, and be able to use the same resources and build 100 or even 150 of them? Because even here, this being the largest of the anti-Borg fleet, it's still only about the size of a New Orleans class. So these were all put into the field by 2370 and were quite successful. And it might have been that the Defiant would be relegated to the dustbin of history, but the one advantage it had over everything, it had the most advanced tactical systems. So it was drawn back out of mothballs and finally put into service in 23 2371. Thanks to Chief Miles O'Brien, the most important man in Starfleet history, after a few less than amazing shakedown tests, the power energy conversions were worked out and new tables were established for the Class 7 warp engine, and this became a functional vessel, able to finally bring its cannons and quantum torpedoes, a blade of armor, to bear. Now, like I said in the beginning of the video, the Romulans and then soon the Borg were the primary threat, but in the 2370s, while those were still concerns, contact was made with the Dominion and the Gamma Quadrant, which was a new immediate present danger, and the Klingon Empire was becoming less and less stable. This trend already started in 2368 with the Klingon Civil War, but only became worse in the 2370s. And since the Klingons have birds of prey, this was a great counter to them. And they would actually end up building more than just the Defiant prototype herself, because again, she was designed to be mass-produced, and since the bugs were now worked out, production models would start rolling off the line by 2372. And then in 2373, after scrapping with the Klingons a year before, she would finally fulfill her destiny, facing off with, damaging, and surviving another Borg cube incursion at the Battle of Sector 001. And from there, she would make a name for herself in the Dominion War in 2374, but then the first Defiant would be lost in 2375 and replaced with USS Sao Paulo, now USS Defiant II. Now, there might be one other member of the anti-Borg fleet you're expecting. It was both part of it and separate. So let's talk about. Considered the most advanced vessel at the Battle of Sector 001, the heavy cruiser, serving as also a battleship during the Dominion War, the Sovereign class. This was a culmination of technologies, and it was designed for war, but also designed to not abandon the Federation, Starfleet's mandate of exploration and diplomacy. And that's actually why many of these were not used during the Dominion War. A few of them served on the front lines, but much as the Constitution classes have been kept out of the fight during the Klingon War 100 years earlier, most of these were sent out in either exploration missions or used for ambassadorial missions. Some were also used as flagships, though. And some were used to go back in time for a little romp-about. But this really is the culmination of technologies from several previous classes. But before we talk about it, let's jump back for just a moment to the Intrepid class, because it came before the Sovereign, and in some ways was a smaller scale version. This is also a bit of a transitional point. This design was not directly involved in the anti-Borg fleet research done at Utopia Planitia, but it did benefit from it. The original USS Intrepid would go for her first shakedown cruise in 2369 and be commissioned in 2370 along with USS Voyager, and others would serve, including USS Bellerophon. This is classed as a light cruiser at about 344 meters long, crew of 140 to 150, and 15 decks. So relatively small, quick, nimble, and it really had some new technology. Not everything, but some. For example, it had a viral neural network for the computer core, basically neuroactive processing for faster, more reactive timing. It also had a variable geometry warp field, And it was the fastest ship type in the fleet when first commissioned, capable of reaching warp 9.975 and cruising at warp 8 more or less indefinitely and at warp 9 for extended periods. So she was fast. She was also quite maneuverable at sublight speeds, which did kind of lend to her scientific role. Yes, she had weapons, phaser arrays, and 4 torpedo tubes, 2 forward, 2 aft. Not quantums, just photons, although, again, they were the most modern version. And she had an interesting shuttle bay that actually was able to generate shuttles out of nowhere. So the unlimited shuttle feature was quite useful. She also was one of the ships that used a backup deflector mounted on the saucer in addition to the primary, because she was designed for longer duration, medium to deep space scientific exploration and diplomatic missions. Because of that, she was also fitted with holodecks, one of the smaller ships to actually have holodecks on board. And while she did not have a blade of armor, it was possible to retrofit this class with a blade of armor if needed. She was designed for war, but in hopes of peace. While the USS Voyager decided to skip off before the Dominion War, the USS Bellerophon and her sister ships were often used as fast convoy VIP vessels during the war. We see one going from DS9 to Romulus quite quickly, making full advantage of their high speed, good shielding, basically the ability to slip out of harm's way quite easily. So, yes, a more well-rounded class, still a light cruiser, but it definitely has that spirit of exploration baked in. And it was a good place to test the new computer technology and also the unlimited shuttle bay technology, which, yes, would lead directly to the Sovereign. An interesting fact about this ship class, even though it was only introduced in the 2370s, it actually dates back decades. The general concept went back to the 2330s, when it was considered to have a next generation battleship to potentially replace the Excelsior. This would be when tensions with the Klingons were uncertain and going through the Cardassian border wars in the 2340s and 2350s. But as relations with the Klingons improved amazingly after the Narendra 3 incident, and as the Romulans really became quiet, and before the Borg and the Dominion, the need wasn't there. So instead, an alternative program, the Galaxy class, was put into service because that was felt to be the ship of the time. The Sovereign design specs, basically computerized model, was revisited in 2365 because the idea was we can not build these but keep the model ready and update it with newer technologies. So things like holodecks and stuff were added to the design that year. Also that year, first contact was made with the Borg. This would lead to another update of the design shortly after Wolf 359 in 2367, where they added guns, weapons, including quantum torpedoes. While it only had one quantum torpedo launcher, it was on a flexible turreted mount. It also had 4 conventional photon torpedo launchers. It had the heaviest phaser arrays at the time. It did have a blade of hull armor, regenerative shielding, and not 1 but 2 binaural computer cores and circuitry. Also the latest in holodecks, so on and so forth. Also 2 fully equipped sick bays, medical wards. It had a more standard shuttle bay in the rear, but it also had quite a cavernous shuttle bay on the saucer, capable of receiving and launching larger vessels like runabouts. No word on if it had the unlimited shuttle generator or not, though. It also had a much more improved deflector dish and quite luxurious crew quarters for what it was. So yeah, the final design specs were laid out by 2368, and the USS Sovereign had her shakedown cruise in 2370, with the Enterprise coming a year later. And by 2372, it was on its first deep space assignment. It would be late, but it would be there for the Battle of Sector 001. This is, of course, like I said, a heavy cruiser, and it is technically longer than the Galaxy at about 685 meters versus 650, but it's much slimmer. Internal volume is less, and it has 24 decks plus 2 engineering pass-through decks as opposed to 42 on the Galaxy. And it had a somewhat smaller crew of 700, although it could carry up to 850 easily. These would typically be either ambassadorial retinues or the staff of a flag officer like an admiral. Anytime you bring an admiral on board, he's going to have 50, even 100 staff members, like we talked about with the Nimitz class from 100 years earlier. So it had provisions already built in to let it act as a flagship and a meeting ship. It even had a warp-capable multi-deck captain's yacht on the underside. This was pretty much the jewel of the fleet and would never be mass-produced like Sabres, Defiance, Steam Runners, Norways. These are very complicated, very large endeavors. But it was a way to show new technology and push it forward. While the Enterprise wasn't really used during the Dominion War, at least on the front lines, she was used more to communicate with allies. She would receive a refit after the war in 2376. She would have improved shielding, as much as 20% stronger, and her warp would be improved. Originally, she was about like the Intrepid class at about warp 9.97, but she would have a slight upgrade to her warp to warp 9.98, even 9.985. And additional phasers were added, and additional quantum torpedo launchers. And then after the incident in Romulan space, she would go in for major repair and as a result refit in 2379. A few more improvements were made, but at this point the design was pretty much pushed as far as it could go, and it would remain one of the most advanced premier vessels in the entire Starfleet all the way into the 25th century. So for roughly 3 decades, this was the best they had. But definitely not all they had. And we've talked mostly about warships or vessels that could double as warships so far, but Starfleet did not abandon the notion of science, research, and exploration at all. So let's kind of go back for a minute and talk about the sometimes maligned, much forgotten California class. When the Galaxy was launched, they knew they couldn't build them in large numbers, nor would they really want to. It was a first contact vessel, deep space exploration vessel, and if needs must, a battle vessel, battleship. This, on the other hand, is almost the exact opposite. This is a workaday ship. In fact, it's a general specialized ship, if that makes sense. It was meant to kind of fulfill, well, day-to-day roles in space. For example, a medical vessel, relief, a VIP ambassadorial transport vessel, negotiations, or an engineering support vessel, or even a salvage operation. In fact, they would even color code these per kind of the configuration of the vessel itself. It was very adaptable, especially when it was being built. And the design goes all the way back to 2363, even a little more, pretty much designed concurrently with the Galaxy to fill in the gaps. And these started to see space a few years later, and they would build about 50 of them in total, and they would serve for decades. Strong, rugged, but not glamorous. Overall length is about 520 meters, total of 20 decks. And the engines were designed not for speed, but for endurance and power, and just reliability. Maximum warp was only 9 for short durations. Maximum sustainable warp for any time at all was 8, and cruise was closer to 6. But for what this was meant to do, that's fine. But what was interesting about the internal layout, it had many conference rooms, repair bays, engineering bays, assembly bays with replicators. It had multiple transporter rooms, as many as 8. It had a total of 3 shuttle bays and carried quite a wide range of shuttle vessels, including the Argo ground survey vehicle. The secondary hull housed, of course, the deflector and warp core, meaning that most everything going on was safely up here in the saucer, which was a total of 11 decks. The remainder were down in the engineering hull or in the pylons. Of course, even though it was designed for support missions, it had phasers and photon torpedo tubes, shielding. But this was just a workhorse of the fleet, doing things behind the lines, supporting diplomatic envoys to planets, responding to distress calls, things that you would expect in a Starfleet. And while it could defend itself, it was definitely not designed for a combat role. In fact, it had a relatively small crew for its size, about 300, 350. So there was plenty of room in the saucer for guests or equipment, what have you. This would be one of the earlier vessels to also feature holodecks, whatever that's worth. And they would continue to manufacture these into the 2370s, although construction was briefly suspended during the Dominion War. It would seemingly start back up afterwards, though. A story that kind of is mirrored with our next vessel. The Nova class deep space science vessel, survey vessel, explorer, research vessel. A small but very intelligent ship, and contemporary with many of the others of the fleet. Also dating back to the days of the galaxy with designs. These were first tested in 2367, and construction on the first models were in 2368, and by 2370 they were very common. In fact, they were able to turn these out well over a dozen a year, and this was meant to replace the Oberth, even some Mirandas, and be a much more capable vessel in pretty much every way that matters. And as you can tell, it does have the newer kind of technical design as well, the post-Wolf 359 look. Like a lot of the newer vessels, it's relatively small, about 220 meters long, total of 8 decks, crew of about 80, so about the same as an Oberth, but much more advanced systems. It is about the same speed as the California Warp 8, but it wasn't really designed for speed. It was designed for long-term missions, doing science or doing survey missions, research missions. In fact, it was even designed where it could just land on a planet or other body and serve as a fixed base of scientific operations. It was able to defend itself, though. It had much improved shieldings over an Oberth, and at least 2 forward-facing and 1 rear-facing photon torpedo. It had standard phaser strips, and it had better armor. It even had a recessed bridge for better defense and also for science stuff. It also had a secondary deflector in the front, a relatively small shuttle bay in the back, and even a bit of a hybrid of a Captain Shot / runabout underneath. Very capable little vessel. These were designed for up to 2-year missions, although in a pinch they could do longer. No holodecks on board, a little too small for that, but they had some more recreational facilities and science facilities compared to, say, a Sabre or Defiant or even perhaps a Norway. But yeah, this was classed as a survey vessel, because of her relatively small size. And while she could defend herself, she was definitely not designed for combat. Even though they had produced quite large numbers of the Nova class, they would suspend them between about 2373 and 2375, right before and during the Dominion War. But they would start up construction again about a year afterwards, because it was a useful class, and it wasn't quite the glass, I don't even say glass cannon, but glass of the Oberth, and actually could stand up. In fact, because it was designed to go into gas giants, maybe even stellar bodies, it was very sturdy. It had good shielding, it had very sturdy frame, very compact. It could put up with a lot of abuse, even if it was more defensively oriented than offensively oriented. And so these were quite popular in Starfleet well into the 25th century as well, and finally let the venerable Oberth and even Mirandas get retired where they should have been done earlier. And as you can tell, technologically speaking, it's about on par with the Intrepid, maybe half a generation earlier than the Sovereign. But you can tell that they are designing these for a more dangerous galaxy just based on the configuration. Our next vessel was introduced right before all the conflicts of the 2370s. The Stormbach class medium cruiser, deep space, high-speed exploration craft. This is pretty much taking the Intrepid design, scaling it up to about 450 meters, slightly larger crew of about 300. In a lot of ways, this is a replacement for the Excelsior, a vast, capable vessel. Had the standard weaponry of the time, but it had improved science facilities, sensor facilities. But this was kind of the alternative to the Intrepid, whereas it did have very powerful engines for its time, reaching a speed of warp 9.8 or greater. It had a more conventional computer system eschewing the binaural circuitry in case that failed. Again, with the Sabre and Defiant originally, makes sense. But whereas the Sabre won out, at least temporarily, over the Defiant class, this time the more advanced Intrepid won out over the more traditional, more conservative Stormbach class. Nevertheless, these were built. They were good rapid response craft, deep space, research vessels, and they could defend themselves. Certainly better than a Nova or California, but nothing like a Sovereign. So one of those, tried and true vessels that was built in small numbers, kind of like the pre-Excelsior types, and would be spotted throughout the fleet for the next couple of decades, but in some ways was a bit of a technological dead end. So the Federation Starfleet kind of went through ebbs and flows when it came to war vessels, combat vessels. They were quite presumptuous with the Galaxy class, even the Nebula. Then the Borg woke them up, so we had the anti-Borg fleet. But then they kind of fell back for a minute, thinking Wolf 359 was it. But then first contact was made with the Dominion, the Klingons did their thing, and then of course the Borg came back 6 years later. So this would lead to the Dominion War. Most of that war was fought by older vessels, including retrofit Galaxy classes that actually got some armament and became quite powerful ships of the line. Of course, quite a few Nebulas fought, and quite a bit of the anti-Borg fleet fought. Not just the Defiant, but all of them. But some new classes, and old is new again, would appear during the Dominion War. And when any young cadet thinks of new ship classes, types developed for and during the Dominion War, their mind's eye immediately turns to the Prometheus class. This was a true wartime vessel, although for paperwork purposes, It was classed as a medium cruiser, deep space exploration, and survey vessel. In reality, like the Defiant, it was a warship, but much larger, and about 415 meters. It was 16 decks, and a crew of roughly 200 to 250. It was quite something. One of our first new quad nacelle designs. She was capable of quite high warp at least 9.8, even 9.9, and of course additional nacelles gives redundancy. She had phaser arrays, quantum torpedo launchers, as well as photon launchers. She was a tough, nimble ship, a blade of armor, basically designed to take on the Jem'Hadar battle cruiser or multiple Jem'Hadar attack fighters, although the multi-vector assault mode feature proved to be less than useful, so it was rarely, if ever, used, much like the saucer separation on the Galaxy 10 years earlier. These were produced in limited numbers for the war and served as specialized strike craft. They could go in, hit hard, and get out quick. So not a well-rounded ship of the line, but yeah, an attack vessel. And one of the most advanced warships that Starfleet would ever produce. Complete with next generation emergency medical services and holodecks for training and everything else. And they would build these in limited numbers throughout the 2370s and 2380s, and they would be kept for when they were needed. So going from something relatively big, at least when it comes to the anti-Borg fleet, we go to what was frankly Starfleet's smallest vessel, the Venture class scout ship. Honestly, this is the same overall length of a runabout, 24 meters, but it is wider. And whereas a runabout almost always operated from a star base, space station, or large ship like a Galaxy class, this was the smallest vessel that would operate independently. That's not to say they could not be attached to other facilities, but these were often stationed on outposts as a survey vessel, reconnaissance, or just emergency transport. So they were capable of quite high warp for their size, at least warp 9 for sustained periods. They had decent shielding. They had dual phaser arrays. They even had a small photon torpedo tube. So, for their size, not bad on the defense. They had very good sensors, long-range, detailed scans, and a standard crew of 4. Although they could hold more in a pinch. These did have their own independent NCC numbers, meaning they were officially their own vessels, their own types. And you can understand why something like this, essentially a more capable runabout, would be useful in wartime. Probing enemy lines, scouting, reconnaissance, even just escape, frankly. So this is right at the edge of where shuttle meets starship. On one hand, it's kind of one. On the other hand, it's technically the other. And this was one of the new vessels introduced during the Dominion War, and would continue on in service for decades afterwards. But not all was new for the Dominion War. Honestly, far from it. Just when you thought they were retired, the Miranda class comes back with the Antares wartime refit. And this was the last and one of the most extensive refits of this venerable old class. For one, thanks to automation and removing of any scientific crew, the number of personnel on board was reduced to 100 or less. It also received completely reworked and overhauled warp nacelles and refurbished warp core, warp engines, improving its top speed as much as warp 9. Shielding was also improved, but let's not kid ourselves. These were classed as destroyers and, frankly, cannon fodder, and they were usually operated in wings. One interesting thing is we have the return of the phaser cannon on these, sometimes seen on the original Mirandas. Makes sense for a Dominion War era thing. But instead of the centerline torpedo pod, we have a sensor pod, given these long-range detection and targeting abilities like an AWACS. The photon torpedoes were actually housed in the saucer section, much like the Wolf 359 era Miranda class types. Many of these served. They were used as destroyer wings, like I said, softening up the enemy, trying to flank them. They were also used extensively for planetary and station patrol routes. When a more important vessel just could not be spared, put one of these on patrol orbit. At least it had a good sensor system, so you might have to run away, but it could at least detect a fleet coming in. And thankfully, just a few years after the Dominion War, the last of the Mirandas were finally retired in the 2380s. Again, this was the last major refit. But the design served for over 100 years. That's a testament to something. I'm not sure what, but something. And our next vessel, well, it's something else. If nothing else, it's memorable. The Jaeger class. This was definitely a wartime expediency. And an interesting role. It's obviously using construction components for the Intrepid class, namely saucer and warp nacelles. But whereas the Intrepid was designed for long-range exploration and speed, this was designed for patrol missions and orbital support, and also atmospheric support. Rather different ship. Of course, you might just say they used whatever parts they had around, but we'll give it a different reason. Slightly longer and larger than an Intrepid at about 360 meters. Slightly larger crew at about 200. Slower warp, though, at about 9.5, for pretty obvious reasons. Its offensive armament wasn't all that special. We had one main phaser array, one phaser cannon, and one forward-facing torpedo tube. But it had quite strong shielding and very good hull armor, so it had endurance. It also had very powerful sublight engines, very powerful impulse engines back here, which gave it sublight speed, maneuverability, and also thanks to the wing structure, it was able to get into an atmosphere and support ground troops there, flying above them, running essentially close air support missions. They also sometimes serve the purpose of filling gaps in the line. If a battle had taken place and the enemy had punched through, these were often kept in reserve and rushed to fulfill the gap when nothing else was available. So literally a stopgap measure. Ship. But it doesn't look it, not at all. Interestingly, it relies on the secondary deflector as its primary deflector. The Intrepid's was here. But then again, it wasn't meant for speed, and it wasn't meant for long-range, deep space missions. These were produced in relatively large numbers, but only during the war, and one must imagine most were mothballed, put in the reserve fleet as quickly as possible, quite frankly. But they defended stations like DS9, colony worlds, and they supported many ground troops. So in some ways, you might consider this the Warthog of the stars. And it's really our last of our Dominion War era ship classes. So in 2375, as the war came to an end, honestly, Starfleet, while battered, while bruised, while bloodied, losing many, many lives, was probably in the best position in the Alpha Quadrant. The Klingons had borne a hard war. The Romulans, well, they had problems of their own soon. The Cardassians were annihilated and would need years, decades to rebuild. The Breen would retreat back to their space. Starfleet, while bloodied a bit, never really had strikes on its home turf. Aside from a few hits on Earth, yeah, their shipyards were left intact. So this was their fleet. But it was very much geared towards war. Would they fall back to a peaceful shipbuilding process? Would they keep on a war footing? Well, they would kind of split the difference, and when new ship types would appear, they would have a bit of the old, a bit of the new, and a bit of the weird. So let's move past the Dominion War into the post-war era, the last 25 years of the 24th century. In 2376, as I said earlier, the production line for the Nova class was started back up. And from there, since it was already kind of ready to go, the first new class type post-war would appear in 2377, the Rhode Island class. Generally, this is based on the same space frame as the Nova, but whereas the Nova was a long-range science survey frigate, this is considered a deep space, long-range, long-duration, heavy exploration frigate. It is capable of at least a 4-year mission, more in a pinch. Keep in mind that the Nova was about 2 years standard. It has improved weapons. It can launch quantum torpedoes, although photons are more common. Somewhat uprated phasers. More powerful shielding. Improved warp drive. As I said earlier, the Nova was capable of warp 8. This could reach about warp 9.5. So still not the fastest, but, it's not really meant to be. And has a little more space and room. It's about 230 meters long, so not quite 10 meters longer than the Nova, and it has 9 decks as opposed to the Nova's 8. A little extra room was achieved by adding a bit to the edge of the saucer there, and a new bridge dome was on top, freeing up the original bridge area to form Deck 2. The nacelles and shuttle bays were slightly reworked as well. It also received new escape pods, advancements, things that changed over the years. Still had a crew of 80 though, so same crew, but because it was a longer duration mission, kind of makes sense. But yeah, these are for deep space exploration missions. Still could do science and survey if it needed to, and they could serve as a combat vessel, border patrol, rapid response. It's a pretty small but capable, well-rounded ship. And these would be produced concurrently with the Novas, making production for both quite easy. And to some extent, this would replace some of the Intrepids in service. But yeah, these were very, very common in the late 24th and early 25th century, and typically their captains were relatively new to the rank, but also had a great deal of first contact and deep space exploration experience. But it was only the beginning. A ship type appearing just a few months after the Rhode Island class was the Parliament class. Advanced engineering construction project vessel. This would partially replace some of the roles fulfilled by the California class, but not all, far from it. It was a little more specialized. Actually, it was a little slimmer. And it had a larger saucer, but not much in this way of a secondary hull. Updated engines, of course. It's about 600 meters long. 11 main decks in the saucer. A very large shuttle bay that took up at least 2 decks. Several large areas for construction, repair, assembly, large industrial capacity replicators, extra powerful tractor beams, that kind of thing. And while it wasn't designed for combat like the California before it, it did have more modern torpedo and phaser systems and uprated shielding. The usual. But it was mostly a workship, just a more specialized and advanced one. It was capable of hitting and achieving and staying at warp 9. So not a speed demon, but it wasn't meant to be. But it could also do a lot of tugging and towing at that. These were considered still quite advanced in the 2380s, but they would not be produced in the same large numbers as the Cali class. They would build a couple of dozen at most. They were very good at what they're meant to do, but they weren't an exploration warship. They were an engineering cruiser. Very streamlined design, though, and it does kind of show a new nacelle aesthetic appearing in the 2370s. Next, we come to a ship class that really was one of the most important since the Sovereign or Galaxy, and like the Galaxy, really embodied the spirit and mantra of Starfleet and the Federation itself, the Luna class. And this took a decade to actually get into deep space, but it turned out to be worth it. The Luna was considered a medium cruiser. It was about 455 meters long, standard crew of 350 to 400, and special care and attention was given to making it comfortable and accessible to not just humans and Klingons, Vulcans, but alien races of all kinds and types, even different atmosphere breathers and whatnot. It was meant to be a multicultural, multiracial, multi-species vessel, and while it could defend itself, it was meant for deep space exploration, long-term missions, diplomatic things, and it actually has its roots dating back to the 2360s. Right when they were designing the Borg fleet, they thought, well, with the new technologies, we really should design an explorer. So it was on the drawing boards and even slated for launch in 2369, but the Sovereign would get priority, as would the Intrepid, and then, of course, tensions with the Dominion, the Klingons, and then the war. This got shelved until after the war. The initial ship, USS Luna, was completed and first was put into space for trials in 2377. And then in 2379, the first 6 ships in the class were ready for their initial deep space missions, including the USS Titan. All of them were named after lunar bodies, commanded by William T. Riker. Not W. Thomas Riker, though. He commanded a very different ship. This was their attempt to really go back out into space, and in a lot of ways was a spiritual successor to the Constitution class. It was meant to be self-sufficient, going out for 5 years at a time or more. It had photon and quantum torpedoes, phaser strips. Had a total of 23 decks, but that does include 2 that were housed in this rear pod. And when you see a pod on a starship, you know it can be modular. In the standard configuration, this pod has 2 photon launchers, tubes up here, and then 2 launchers capable of quantum torpedoes are actually in the main hull near the deflector dish. But of course you could put a sensor pod there. So in some ways it's a lot like the Galaxy, the Constitution. In other ways it's kind of like the Miranda and the Nebula, that medium thing. Because while this was designed for deep space exploration, and when the first ships went out, several were sent to investigate the Gamma Quadrant and the Beta. Eventually they'd even be sent into the Delta. Others were sent to patrol the demilitarized zone near what was left of Cardassian space and be sent on peacekeeping and negotiation missions. So they had quite adequate ambassadorial facilities on board as well. But it was a small, efficient ship, not a huge thing like a Galaxy class. But these would serve in quite large numbers well into the 25th century, and quite possibly would be replacing most of the Mirandas. Like I said, the few that were left after the Dominion War were slated for retirement by 2380, right as the Lunas were coming online. And of course they would have the newer computer systems, up-to-date holodecks, and most importantly, a jazz lounge. Let's move from one of the most advanced and eye-catching ships of the 2380s to one that is again kind of underappreciated like the Cali class, but also extremely vital. The Wallenberg class, sometimes referred to as a tug, but that's a bit dismissive from what this is. It's a multi-purpose, multi-use spacecraft with its roots in the Dominion War. It's 300 meters long, and the crew is extremely variable. If needs be, it only needs a couple of dozen to operate. It does have phasers for defense, that's about it. It's capable of warp, but nothing excessive, 8 to 9. Its main feature and purpose is to use very powerful tractor beams and/or magnetic locking systems to engage cargo pods, freight pods, or even passenger pods, habitation tubes. It can carry hundreds, maybe even thousands of passengers with the right tube attached, or tens of thousands of tons of cargo. So it could carry these between star systems, or it could be used at shipyards like Utopia Planitia to aid in construction, a supply depot, moving bits and bobs around. And these are just built in extremely large numbers, and they of course could be tailored to their exact needs. You can see the large emitters under the what is effectively a truncated saucer section, cut back to allow work area. Quite large nacelles for its type, and then again you have a large cargo pallet attachment on the rear and bottom. Again, not glorious, but very important, and named for a 20th century diplomat that saved many lives. Can't forget about the Wallenberg class. However, Starfleet is kind of running up against a wall yet again. Cochrane's first warp engine design essentially limited ships to warp 2. Henry Archer's design, based on Cochrane's, would push that to warp 5. After the establishment of the Federation, new technology would lead to warp 7. From there, the Constitution class would push to the limit the original Archer-style system, and the Constitution refit would introduce a new vertical warp core system, and that would be pushed to warp 9. From there we have the Excelsior. Capable of trans-warp, it was a new step forward and really set the tone for the entire 24th century, and actually led to recalibrating the warp scale, with warp 10 being infinite velocity. So throughout the 24th century, we've crept from warp 9 to 9.3 to 9.5, 6, and in this video we've seen 9.8, and even 9.9 and 9.99, and you see where this is going. But they're hitting a wall. That's as fast as they can go. It's very, very fast by human standards today, but if one wanted to traverse the galaxy 100,000 light years, you're still looking at decades of travel time, and that's if you don't drop out of warp. Starfleet needed something new. The vertical warp engine had worked for a very long time, a century. Still was a good piece of kit, but experiments began, even before the Dominion War, on something new. Pre-war experiments would of course be suspended for the war, but would start back up afterwards, resulting in the Altair class. A very odd-looking vessel, although you can really see a resemblance to the Saber. This was an attempt to get some more warp speed, also to improve maneuverability, changing of direction, all that in warp, especially high warp. For a time, it was one of the most maneuverable and the fastest ships in the fleet, capable of hitting warp 9.9. However, it was thirsty. The engines were not terribly efficient because it was essentially a modified core. And in one way, they kind of went back to a horizontal engine, but it was kind of a hybrid. By the way, this is a very thin design. Overall length is about 325 meters, but of course, internal volume is not much. In fact, this is only about 40 meters tall at its highest point, so only a few decks, and of course, most of that devoted to gear, science equipment. This was never put into production as a class. A few prototypes and test beds were made, but that's pretty much where they remained. They would test out new equipment, new technology on board. They would be used for a few missions, but in the end, this updated core warp system, it didn't work. It just wasn't efficient. They weren't really getting the gains out of it for the cost. And let's be honest, it's a very odd-looking vessel at that. But it does show Starfleet's effort to try something new. But they would catch a lucky break in 2378. The year the Intrepid class USS Voyager made it home from the Delta Quadrant. And in their 7+ years there, they picked up a few hitchhikers and some new technology. Most importantly, quantum slipstream drive technology, originally from species 916, Arcturus' species. This was a much faster way to travel. Not instantaneous, not warp 10, but much, much faster. For example, 20,000 light years in a month. So essentially, about 800 light years in a week. So, in a day. So, yeah, much faster than the Voyager, which itself was quite fast, warp 9.975 maximum, although it could never sustain that. Now, the whole story of the Dauntless is something for another time, but I will say that when Captain Janeway, soon promoted to Admiral Janeway, returned, engineers at Utopia Planitia in the Daystrom Institute set about studying and reworking the whole design. Since the Voyager crew had had ample time to do complete scans of the vessel, they were able to quickly reproduce it. While the Federation-produced version, first seen in 2380 and first put into space in 2381, would look very similar, it would have a few differences from the original Alien mocked-up version, but it had its speed. The Federation quantum slipstream drive wasn't quite as efficient, couldn't quite go as far as long, but it was still much faster than warp, traditional warp. This would be the next phase, the next step forward in space technology. Now, the original Dauntless class, be it the original Species 916 or this Federation version, was quite small, just over 200 meters long, And it had 7 full decks with 1 engineering through deck, so 8 decks in complete total. It was meant to have a crew of about 80, although, well, Voyager obviously expected to squeeze 120 on board for a 7-week cruise, as it were. It was pretty austere inside. Handful of replicators, 1 main transporter room, and no holodecks, and 1 shuttle bay, phasers, and photon torpedoes for defense, but that wasn't its purpose. And a very different style of deflector dish to work with the quantum slipstream drive. So a small ship, a scout ship, a frigate, but a beginning. And whereas the Altair class was pretty much a failed experiment, the Dauntless class was a qualified success. It wasn't perfect. Again, the slipstream drive did show some instability, especially when it was run long and hard. But it didn't blow up and crash the ship into an ice planet, so they're already ahead of the game. They would build these in actually quite significant numbers, using them as a scout, rapid response vessel, and a VIP transport if someone didn't mind the austere thing. I will say the Federation version would get a holodeck because, yeah, people got a holodeck. But it filled the role in the fleet and was one of the, small scale, small class ships, not unlike the Sabre in a lot of ways. And they would serve not only into the 25th century, but throughout the entire 25th century, of course in upgraded versions, not actually being retired until the 26th century. The Dauntless class, quite an interesting Starfleet vessel, and it would actually lead to the next generation. Based on information from the Dauntless, not to mention the Sovereign, the next step forward would be the Vesta class, with USS Aventine being the most famous member. This had quantum slipstream drive, a bit limited, but more refined thanks to its larger size. It's actually quite a long, narrow vessel for accessing the quantum slipstream at nearly 670 meters long, a crew of 700, with a large portion dedicated to maintaining the slipstream drive, but not all. Had about 22 decks, and while it did have quantum torpedoes, phasers, the usual, it was intended for researching, science, testing new equipment, diplomatic missions. Again, it was really, really fast for the fleet, so getting to places for rapid response, very important. And the initial class would fly in 2381, and the first 4 members of the class would launch on their initial missions in 2383. And this would be one of the first large-scale applications of quantum slipstream technology, although it must be said that standard warp was maintained. For going short distances, it was more efficient, it was more reliable, it was safer. And by this point, ships are reaching warp 9.9 or greater, so if you're only going a few light years, the difference is negligible. So definitely a pure science vessel, but just enough for self-defense. However, just as things are going quite well, news of the impending explosion of the Romulan Riemann star comes out in 2384. It'll go nova 2 years later, and that makes a diaspora of Romulans and Riemanns throughout the galaxy, which destabilizing things. The Klingon Empire goes through things. The Borg pop in a time or two. Space isn't as violent as it was a few decades earlier, but it's not the safe space that the galaxy was created in either. It's kind of in between. So now that we have a new warp system, it's kind of time to return to some tactical type ships. Named to pay tribute to the USS Valiant, a Defiant class vessel, we have the Valiant class. And this is very much based on the Defiant destroyer, but streamlined a bit for the 2380s and 2390s. It's also actually a little bit smaller at roughly 100 meters, a crew of 35. It has modern tactical systems, quantum torpedo tubes, pulse phasers, but only 2, not 4, but they are more powerful, more advanced blade of armor, regenerative shielding, something first tried out on the Sovereign, capable of much higher standard warp than a standard Defiant, and capable of limited slipstream as well. This was the first slipstream combat vessel. So it gave up a little bit in terms of weapon power to fully power the slipstream drive, but 2 pulse cannons, a phaser array, and a total of 3 torpedo tubes, 2 forward, 1 rear, is nothing to slouch at. Plus, by this time, the Defiant was getting 20 years old, the design. So this was a destroyer escort, combat patrol, scout vehicle, just to kind of keep an eye on the lines and make sure everything is going as it should. You can tell it's just a little bit more streamlined, like with the deflector module. The nacelles are reshaped a bit. Still has the recessed bridge. And it's overall just a little bit flatter with 3 decks instead of 4 full decks. Good support craft. But as the 2390s roll on, the new star of the show, at least when it comes to tactical cruisers, would be the Inquiry class heavy cruiser, or fast response cruiser, and its 2 main variants. These were designed for max efficiency, automation, and large-scale mass production. Over 200 were made if you count all the subclasses, but generally speaking, they were the same vessel. A bit of a one-size-fits-all, with a few concessions. Not only are the nacelles modular, but the deflector dish is as well. We see variations in it. These were tested in the late 2380s, and the initial vessel, USS Inquiry, went into space trials in 2393, and by 2396 they were in full operational service. These are manned by only about 500 people, although they can operate with fewer, again highly automated. The combat variant is 630 meters long, and the more long-range variant is about 640, but the difference is just in the nacelles. They have the most up-to-date shielding, a blade of armor, quantum torpedoes, phasers, and of course both conventional and slipstream drive technology. The combat variant is slightly slower, but more maneuverable in warp, and it has more protected nacelles, more armor on them. And the rapid response type, or the deep space type, is faster, at least in a straight line in warp, maybe slightly less maneuverable, and maybe has slightly more exposed nacelles, for whatever that's worth. The hull plating on these vessels kind of shows a new design aesthetic, very smooth, somewhat reminiscent of what we saw in the early and mid 23rd century with the original Constitution class. But yeah, these were often used in Starfleet's rapid response, the rapid reaction force. These are often called a strike cruiser for that reason. They're meant to be able to work in groups, get together, coordinate, even have centralized command, and go where needed and get there very quickly thanks to the quantum slipstream drive. This is why we see a fleet of them very rapidly assembled in the year 2399. And the ship would continue to serve throughout the 25th century and well into the 26th. Internally, it was quite Spartan, not quite as bad as some of the other truly combat ships, but not as well appointed as the Galaxy or even Nebula or even Luna, somewhere in between. This was a serious no-nonsense vessel. While it could go on deep space exploration missions, they were usually sent out for relatively short duration missions and then returned to base until needed again. Other vessels in the fleet did more of the science and exploring duties. So in some ways, being on the Inquiry class could be quite dull. Nevertheless, Starfleet definitely needed something to replace the hundreds of Excelsiors, Obersts, and Mirandas, and this could at least do part of it, alongside the other vessels we've talked about today. But as we close out the 24th century, Starfleet has one more hold my synthahol moment. One more grand gesture, very much in the spirit of the Galaxy class. The Odyssey class Dreadnought cruiser. Why Dreadnought? Because this thing was meant to put the Galaxy to shame when it comes to volume and crew. Over 1,000 meters long. Remember, the Galaxy was just under 650. This had a crew of 2,000 to 2,500, but could carry many more for VIP ambassadorial missions or for evacuation. Interestingly, because of the cavernous internal spaces, it actually had fewer decks than the Galaxy. It had only 30 full decks, although there were many engineering and pass-through and shuttle bay type decks as well. This is a massive vessel, quite possibly one of the largest Starfleet would build for quite some time. After building small and medium destroyers and cruisers for so long, it's interesting to see them return to this pattern. But they did their best to make sure it wasn't a glass cannon like the Galaxy, capable of course warp 9.99, quantum slipstream, photons, quantums, the most up-to-date phasers, redundant dual regenerative shielding, ablative armor, even pioneering the use of transphasic torpedoes in limited numbers. This had a very large bridge. It even had not just a captain's yacht, but a full auxiliary starship attached that could be sent out for reconnaissance missions or just patrol and defense of the vessel, which in and of itself was almost a fleet in and of its own. Indeed. This was their main deep space, very long duration, 5, even 10-year missions, and it could operate for even longer than that, with many amenities on board. The latest in holosuites, not just holodecks, holosuites now, and full cabins for everyone, because if you're going to keep people cooped up on the ship, at least give them some privacy. By this point, the quantum slipstream drive technology has really been ironed out and is quite efficient. It still has some cooldown limitations, of course, especially shooting a vessel of this mass through space and subspace, but still. This could fight, but it was an explorer, an ambassadorial ship. This was, if the Galaxy was a floating town in space, this was a true floating city in space with everything you could think of. Industrial replicators, of course a full hospital. They would not build many of these, much like with the Galaxy. The plan was only to build 6, maybe later more. Of course, the USS Odyssey was the prototype, first tested at the tail end of the 24th century, and the USS Enterprise NCC 1701F would launch in the year 2401, along with her sister ships. Initially there were 3 in the class, eventually 6. These are often used by officers, admirals, if they were in Federation space. But of course, when they were in deep space discovery mode, they would have a captain as normal. Definitely the jewel in the Federation's crown, and I think it was their attempt to reassert their peaceful, scientific mission of curiosity. And if that didn't work out, we had a few hundred inquiry classes behind it at the lines. So, while they were getting back to exploration, they did not return to the complacency of the Golden Age, the Galaxy class era. It seems they more or less learned their lesson. Alright, now we come to the part of the video where I talk real world and my opinions and thoughts. And, well, let's begin with the Defiant, because this was the next generation in all ways. This was in universe, one of the first post-Wolf 359 ships, yes. But also, it was really one of the new ship styles we've seen. This came at the beginning of Season 3 of DS9, which would have been fall of 94, because Season 1 came in the winter/spring of 93, so, yeah. And this was radically different than what we'd seen before. I remember in magazines that summer, this was playing a prominent role because it was going to be a big change for not just DS9, but Starfleet in general, their first warship. And it's really interesting because all the elements are here. You have nacelles, you have a deflector, even a bridge, but everything, and even a saucer, but it's all mixed and matched, and it's identifiable as Starfleet, but also identifiable as just the USS Defiant, or Benjamin Sisko's motherfucking pimp hand, as Lore Reloaded said years ago, and I still think is one of the funniest things I've heard on the internet about Star Trek. This, of course, became iconic and started a whole new generation, warships, new technology. Now, the first time I ever knew what the Defiant looked like, a friend had built a model in the late 90s and brought it to my house for me to look at. So I knew what it looked like before Eaglemoss. But this is a nice little diecast miniature. This is metal, the nacelle blocks, and the deflector, which, yeah, some beta canon says was meant to be jettisoned as a secondary weapon, kind of taking the... Basically, like, it saw the Galaxy shooting a beam out of its deflector and said, "Hold my beer." It's meant to be shot off as a final torpedo, although it never happened in the show. The bridge is recessed, but still on top. But again, this is only 4 decks, or 5. The reason I said a pass-through deck, it's meant to have 4 decks, but in at least one episode they reference deck 5. So let's say there's an engineering deck. Just to kind of make it... This happens. In fact, the size of the Defiant is debatable, depending on when you see it. There's a real studio model in the show, in space. There's a CGI or two, and we see it on planets and other places. Sometimes it looks almost 70, 80 meters. Other times, some people claim it's 170 meters, but that's pretty long. I mean, like a Miranda class is just over 200 meters. This is considered a small ship. It's pretty thin. I think 120 to 150 is a pretty accurate range, but we don't really know. That kind of puts it on par with Jem'Hadar fighters and whatnot, and it really shows a change in Starfleet and really Star Trek in general. Before that, it was old ships of the line, 18th century sailing, one ship a lot of times versus 1 or 2 other ships. Maybe if you had 3 or 4 ships, it was considered a large grouping. I mean, again, the Battle of Wolf 359 was considered a huge force, and it was 40 ships. But these ships were also massive. In the TOS era, 300-ish meters, and by the time of TNG, 600 or so meters. This is getting down into the hundreds. This is also why eventually we see fleets of hundreds, even thousands in DS9. So it does mark a change. They didn't ever quite go to fighters, although there are things like the Peregrine that are kind of in background. But no, overall, I like it. And this became an iconic vessel and gave DS9 a flavor all its own. But this is the final product. Thanks to Eaglemoss, we have 2 concepts. And here's the first. Yes, the USS Equinox, the Nova class. The general design started off as a proposal for the Defiant when they were creating it in 93, 94, in that time period. Obviously, they didn't go with it. This was the more conservative design. And obviously, the proposal didn't look exactly like this. When this was finally featured at the end of Season 5 of Voyager as the Equinox, it had been slightly reworked and updated. But generally, yeah. And this also kind of explains why the Equinox, a fan favorite, looks kind of warlike, even though it's supposed to be a survey science ship. And this is supposed to be the replacement for the Oberth. It looks a lot meaner and tougher. It's cut out in the front. Most noticeably, this recessed bridge. The compacted hull. Even visible torpedo tubes front and rear. And speed fins on the nacelles. I'm glad they reused it because it is a good design. And I think they made the right call by not going with it, because while it's a nice design as a secondary ship like the Equinox, if this had been the Defiant, I don't think it would become as iconic. This is identifiable as Starfleet, Federation, Star Trek. The Defiant is identifiable as the Defiant. This just doesn't quite have that level of distinction, even if it's a very nice design. Nice model from Eaglemoss too. Did a very good job with it. Now instead they went with this. This is from Eaglemoss. This is the Valiant, aka the Defiant concept. And as you can see, it is. In fact, it's so close that if you look in Season 3 of DS9, at like the computer displays, the schematics of Defiant on the show, they actually use this profile rather than the finalized version because they had been made before. This happened in Wrath of Khan too. If you notice, the schematics on the Enterprise refit are actually more like the Enterprise Phase 2. Not a big deal, and they were corrected later. And it is very similar. The deflector housing is a little more integrated. This is a little wider. The nacelles stick out a little more. We've got a little more greebly stuff going on front and back. In some ways, this is a sleeker design to me. That's why I put it in my headcanon timeline forward. But I wanted to include it. It's really neat. And Eaglemoss, that's what they were great at, was giving us weird little concepts like these. Whereas the first two we looked at were in the regular collection. This was considered a bonus because it was a concept. But it's very heavy. It's actually pretty much all metal. A little bit of plastic on the bottom in certain areas. But yeah, this is a heavy, chunky design. I'm really glad they did it. Because, I mean, who doesn't like the Defiant? And, of course, the name Valiant comes from the episode, what was it, Season 6, I believe, with Nog and the Red Squad, where the Defiant class Valiant is destroyed, trying to kill the Dominion battleship. So it's a good callback. And that itself could even be a callback to the second pilot of the original series, the first one with Kirk, Where No Man's Gone Before, where the SS Valiant was lost at the edge of the galaxy. Either way, we talked about the Valiant in the first episode of this series. But yeah, that's the Defiant for you. It gave DS9 a flavor all its own and really kind of set the tone for the show getting good. It's the metaphorical equivalent of the show Riker growing a beard type thing. But that was 94, 95 era. Right around the same time, a new series was in development. In fact, DS9 was only alone on the air for half a season, fall through Christmas. January of 1995, we got Voyager. A show in which a captain made no controversial decisions at all. Tuvix. And of course, a new vessel was needed. And they went for a more conventional design versus the Defiant, but this was meant to be a long-range show, traveling alone, but also in what was considered a fast, smart ship for that era. So really around the same time, or just right on the heels of the Defiant being developed, we got the Intrepid class here. And you do start to see this new design aesthetic that will be carried over. A longer versus wider saucer, little to no goosenecking, a wider deflector, but not quite the Galaxy style, different types. Torpedo tubes, of course. A more sleek rear section. Of course, most importantly, the infinite shuttle bay. But it's like they gave them a memo. Something has to move, so they went with the mobile pylons for the nacelles. That's supposed to be there in universe to change the geometry of the warp field. I think in reality it was just to give kind of an action thing, but it really doesn't make sense. Why not just leave them in the upward position? What good does putting them flat do, except if maybe you want to land or something? That's another thing. Eaglemoss gave us quite a few Voyagers, including the armored one. I'm surprised they didn't give us a landed Voyager like they gave us the landed bird of prey. It's a bonus, not on the standard issue, but with the legs out and the nacelles up. But they didn't. This one came early in the series, as you'd expect. And they did good on the model. Where they kind of fell down was on the stand. I'm sure in an effort to hide the stand as much as possible, they put it on the rear, and it stays on okay. But later Voyager variants, they would go to the kind of clip-on behind the saucer style like we see on a lot of other ships, and that's more logical. Trial and error. But they did a good job. It's mostly metal with a little plastic where needed. And this was a new era. This was, even though Paris says this was designed for war, it seems to be more of a science ship. But that does track with a post Wolf 359 era. Even science ships would be armed up. But it's an explorer. If the Enterprise was the deep space heavy explorer, heavy cruiser, this is the medium counterpart. We also see these used in DS9 as convoy ships, transport ships. And while the Voyager model was mostly kept just to be the Voyager, other Intrepids would pop up occasionally during the Dominion War. Just to let you know that the Voyager wasn't the only one in the fleet. Now, I really like the design of the Voyager. I think it was a good hero ship. Very identifiable as Starfleet, but it's very different from the Galaxy and the Defiant classes that were around it. So that was 985, and we would see this in both CGI and studio models. That's actually why, unfortunately, the Voyager didn't get a lot of changes. I think the show would have been neat if it not only accumulated damage, but changes, alien tech incorporated. They played around with it a little bit. For example, the Borg episode at the beginning of Season 4 and towards the end, the Year of Hell. But since they relied on stock footage so much and a CG and a studio model for some footage, this was not only the ship of a magical shuttle bay, but also magical cosmetic repairs. Voyager was an enjoyable show. Unfortunately, it had the premise, the ability to be a great show, and it really fell short, unfortunately. But that's not to say it wasn't a travesty. It just became same as always. And it was basically Next Generation 2.0. That's okay. It just would have been nice if it had found its own identity. But luckily for us, DS9, which, let's be honest, started off with an okay but not terribly inspired premise, and the first season for sure was definitely very standard, it did find its own identity. So, you win some, you lose some. That's how it goes. And of course we have concepts for the Intrepid too. The Defiant was quite different, and I think different was in the air. Because this was an early concept from 94, maybe 93. The Altair. I get it, they wanted something that looked fast. Voyager was supposed to be the fastest ship in the fleet at the year 2370. So they gave her very long, very skinny nacelles, a very interesting engineering hull. Tiny little deflector up here. Little bridge. I'm sure this would have gone into production like this, but, concept kind of reminds me of some of those concept Excelsiors we saw for Search for Spock, because the idea was a fast ship, Next Generation. And good on Eaglemoss for doing this. This was a bonus edition. It's actually almost all metal, even the back section. Only the nacelles are plastic. But of course it's very spindly. But if you were to measure it corner to quarter, it's one of the largest. Just extremely thin. This has never really much gone anywhere. It's appeared on a few calendars and whatnot, and of course we have this now. Could very well be the only model ever made of this ship. By the way, it sits on its stand okay, but it really needs a better rake to it because it likes sliding off. So be careful with that, especially as spindly as it is. These nacelles would actually later be used in modified form on the Enterprise J, though. And actually, I think the overall layout of that would also inspire a ship we're about to talk about. But before we get there, here's the concept that went further. The Rick Steinbach designed Voyager. This is not the same, obviously, but you can see elements. The deflector, the protruding torpedo tubes, the bridge towards the rear of the quote-unquote saucer, although they'd move it a little bit forward. The secondary deflector here, the triangular saucer. The big departure was with the engineering hull area, but the shuttle bay area looks the same, or very similar. But then you get to the engines kind of dipping down. Honestly, instead of the variable ones, I think having underswept nacelles actually would be better, but they shortened them. Basically, this was meant to look fast. It reminds me a lot of an Excelsior. So I think it actually fits in the fleet very well. But I think they wanted Voyager not only to look fast, but also maneuverable, sleek. So they squatted her up a bit. And this is mostly metal too. The engineering hull, the nacelles are another thing. These nacelles even kind of remind me of a Enterprise refit style. Interesting we did it. You can definitely see where this was turned into the standard Intrepid. Pretty neat, in my opinion. I like studying concepts, what could have been. And from this, they, got the Intrepid. But anyway, like I said, that was 94, 95 for these. 96, we had the second TNG film, First Contact. And for that, a new ship was needed because, Deanna crashed the original Galaxy-class Enterprise D in the last one. Thus, we ended up with the USS Enterprise NCC 1701E. The Sovereign class. The D was a practical model, and it was made in a 1980s frame of mind. The Hilton in space. It was meant to be a ship of peace, exploration, but also meant to be very comfortable. And it shows. I could lie and say I love the Enterprise D. I don't hate it. I really do. I mean, I grew up with Next Generation as my Star Trek. I watched TOS as reruns, but I watched TNG when it was new. The Enterprise D I liked. I even bought the diecast toy model that came out in, 88? The one that could saucer separate. But I kind of like the TOS, I like the TMP the most. And I even like the Enterprise C a little more in the Excelsior. But I get it, different thing, and they wanted to make it distinctive. But it was meant for color TV, 19 to 26 inches, and it's nice that they did carry it over to the first film, but it really wasn't meant for 1990s theatrical things, especially with the more action-oriented tone of the films. So the Sovereign was born, meant to look faster and meaner, meant to integrate the technology. And that's the thing, too. If we kept on with the D, we'd have the same tech we've had before. We could say it had a refit, but, with all the new developments because of the Defiant and the Voyager and everything, this can have quantums. It can have, much faster warp, just a more modern look. And we have the kind of reverse saucer from the Galaxy. Fun fact, back in the day, the quote-unquote Nova class, not the one you know, but a totally different Nova, that was a little bit like this, was slated to be the replacement for the Galaxy. We're talking back, if you look at the encyclopedia, in 1990. But anyway, this is created for the films, and would actually be changed up quite a bit between each one. especially for Nemesis. And if you picked up one of the Playmates toys or models, whatever you want to call them, in the 90s, since it was built on concepts, not the full production model, it too looked pretty different, namely in the back area here. And this is a good model from Eaglemoss for the scale, the size. They did well, but it's kind of light because this is metal, but this is plastic. It's just long. This is one of the few that I do think the XL version really gives something more. A lot of the XLs just kind of come across as, larger versions of the standard, but the XL on this is really pretty neat. But this one's not bad. They pack a lot in for the 700-meter ship. Fits it stand well, as you can see. But this was the new ship for the new film, meant to lead a new era. This was the most advanced ship in the fleet. The heavy cruiser, the battleship that would ride to the rescue, because the plan was to have a big battle with the Borg in space. It was moved around for a bit, but eventually they decided to start it off at the beginning of the movie, and then the action would slow down, and then the action would be very up close and personal at the end. Interesting touch. I think it worked very well. I saw First Contact opening night, or at least opening weekend, I can't remember, at the theaters, and it gave an energy to the film that might have been missing if we waited all the way to because everyone knew there was going to be a big battle with the cube. It had to happen. Let's get that out of the way so we can kind of move on to more interesting plot points, you know what I mean? It's like if they'd blown up the Death Star at the beginning of Return of the Jedi. Could have made a very interesting film, because everyone knew how that film was going to end the moment you saw the Death Star. You know? But anyway, this was the newest ship. And in years past, when CGI really wasn't available and you had to go with studio models, you might get one or two new ships in the fleet and then reuse other ones. But thanks to CGI coming around in the 90s, we were able to have a First Contact fleet. In one go, in one movie, we got 5 new Starfleet ships. Technically, yeah, there were more in Wolf 359, but those were true kit bashes, small scale, small screen, burnt and broken. These were ships that were in the prime. And this is, of course, what was meant to be created to fight the Borg. And along with the Defiant, they did just that quite effectively. Now, again, the Sovereign was the star of the show. The model was as high quality as they could make it. There was even a studio model, not just CGI. These would all be CGI. And by today's standards, low quality, low poly, relatively low texture res. But in 96, this is really good. Some more than others, but we have these. Now, of course, some older ships were in there just to give a sense of a fleet. I believe there was some nebulas. There was even an Oberth hanging out. And as is famously known, the Millennium Falcon makes a guest appearance too. But let's talk about each of these and kind of my thoughts real quick, because it's great that Eaglemoss, quite early on in the collection, gave us the entire First Contact fleet, as they would also the Wolf 359 fleet. Let's begin with one of the most successful of this new fleet that we'd see the most on screen, and the one that kind of reminds me of the Voyager concept if you shortened it up a bit, the Saber. In some ways, cool, different design, like the Defiant, but also more identifiable. I could see this as an alternative to the Defiant. It's more conservative design. From certain angles, it looks pretty standard. Interesting how they integrated the end of the nacelles into the saucer instead of the engineering hull. Very traditional deflector. But a very compact design. Bigger than the Defiant, but smaller than anything else. I'm going to call it a cruiser. Excuse me, a destroyer. You can call it a light cruiser or a frigate if you want. Doesn't really matter. It's neat. And we see these kind of flying in wings. And it's aptly named. It kind of reminds me of a saber. It doesn't look like a saber, but the way they would swoop in. And that's what's neat about this. The Next Generation benefited from movie quality models. The Miranda, the Oberth, the Excelsior. Well, with First Contact making these new ships, once they were done with them, they handed these over to DS9, and so these were able to be featured in the Dominion War, and you see waves of sabers in the war, which makes complete and total sense. So it works for First Contact, works for that, and I think the design is new and creative, but just similar enough to pass, especially when you consider the Defiant and the Intrepids are around. It fits right in. Even if they don't love the Saber, I think most people like it enough. But the next one, our Steam Runner, is more of a love it or hate it ship. Pretty conventional and compact, and has the nacelles embedded in the saucer again, but then we have this engineering hull hanging in the back here. Now, one could argue it makes ejecting the warp core that much easier. But of course, it's really just there to look cool and different. And it does, even though it looks kind of like a flat iron from the top. It's a cool flat iron. Underslung. I do like it. I've always have. It does kind of remind me of an older design. Even though these all came out around the same time, both in the real world and in universe, this seems like one that might have been a little more conservative or on the drawing boards a few months longer. This seems it feels a little older. And Eaglemoss did a really good job with this one. This is all metal. The only plastic is kind of this bottom cap here. But this is metal. So it's very heavy. Now, one thing they had to do, the original CGI models and files and everything, when Eaglemoss started doing these, they had to kind of upscale them, adding more detail when they started printing the models. So in some ways, these are actually more detailed and higher quality than what was in the film originally in '96. Well, then we can talk about this. Both the Saber and Steam Runner were successfully integrated into the DS9, and there were plans to integrate the Norway. Except, as is famously known, the files, the CGI model, was either lost, or more likely, it seems now, the files were corrupted / incompatible. Either way, they weren't able to display this in DS9. It also seems like this was the lowest res originally ship in the First Contact fleet, meant to be in background scenes and whatnot. So we do see this in DS9, but it's only on displays and monitors and images, that kind of thing. So it does confirm that it was in the fleet, but that's about it. Nacelles are more conventional, but no engineering hull. It's actually integrated into the rear of the saucer, kind of like the Defiant. And also like the Defiant, instead of relying on phaser strips, this is meant to rely on pulse cannons, phaser cannons, which I think is really cool. I think it's neat to have a kind of artillery ship or gunboat ship. I've always kind of had a sneaking admiration for the Norway. Maybe it's just because it's been the most elusive of the First Contact ships. In fact, thanks to Eaglemoss, knowledge of it has gone up quite a bit because it was kind of lost to memory for a long while. But this is similar to the Steam Runner, metal nacelles until you get, this is plastic and the front of the nacelles is plastic, but the back's metal. They did a good job. It's very thin. The whole idea with these ships is they were meant to be hard to hit flying through space and just compact and more survivable. Plus, they were meant to be smaller where they cost less crew and they could build more to overwhelm the Borg with like a mob. And then finally, we have our big fan favorite, the Akira. So, the Saber is a destroyer, or a frigate if you prefer. The Steam Runner and Norway are light cruisers. This is the medium cruiser. This is the next one down from the Sovereign. Some specs give this a crazy number of torpedo bays or a crazy large shuttle bay system. That's a bit much, but it has multiple torpedo bays. It has 3 shuttle bays. It's a very capable, interesting ship. And it does resemble kind of the others in a lot of ways. It has the engineering, or at least a pod back here looking like a hull, hanging back. Has the separate nacelles, ribbing. It's a neat design. So it became a fan favorite. They even made an XL version. And as is famously known, there was a push when Enterprise was being developed to just reuse this model as the NX-01. Luckily, cooler heads that knew the fandom better prevailed, and I really don't think the NX looks too much like the Akira. I think there's a nod to it, but that's no more of a nod than any Enterprise did. Look at the original Enterprise versus, the Enterprise C versus the D. There's always that. So, if nothing else, I think the Akira is just based on the old style. That's the thing. When they screw up and we notice it, for example, putting the Katinga in Season 1 of Enterprise, but we don't always know, often don't, when they make the right call, like making a new model for the NX and so on and so forth. So, credit where credit's due for not reusing it, even though it's a good ship. That said, not only has this appeared in DS9, it also made more than a few appearances in Voyager and other areas. Again, fan favorite, neat design, conventional enough. It's probably the most conventional of the 4 ships, but that's not a bad thing. It's plenty unique enough itself. And the most successful out of these. At least most think. So the fleet did first fight the Borg, hence the first contact or Sector 001 fleet name in 2373, but they would really become iconic in the real world and in universe because of their use in the Dominion War. We didn't see any sovereigns in the Dominion War because they wanted to hold them back for the movies, but we saw all of these, except again the Norway. Fresh new ships for the war. There would be a few others. Before we move on though, this first part here was actually a re-recording. I had some mic issues. The second half, the mic was a little janky. Sorry for the echo, but I think I'm still intelligible. Basically, part of the connector got unplugged partially, and yeah, things happen. If you've done videos, you get it. I'm not going to re-record the entire thing, just this first part here. But yeah, I think this is one of the highlights of Eaglemoss, doing first the first contact fleet in its entirety, and then soon after the entire Wolf 359 fleet. So in universe, these ships were created to fight the Borg, but in reality, they ended up fighting the Dominion more than the Borg. Although, back the Battle of Sector 001, they did fulfill their original purpose, as did the Defiant. So that's good. And like I said, in practical terms, the Sovereign was pretty much held back for the movies, but the Steamrunner, Saber, and Akira really appeared in DS9, with the with the Saber really being around a lot, which makes sense in universe and in the show too, because this would be a good little companion to the Defiant, about the same scale, so you can use the same VFX shots. Like a powerful little brother to the Defiant. Now, of course, as most of you probably know, the Norway would have been in DS9 too, because they transferred all the VFX, all the image files over to the production team at DS9, including even the uniforms those actors wore. But this one was either lost or corrupted, depending on who you ask. So in reality, we only really see the Norway in background shots on computer monitors, but it was supposed to be there. It just, the ship file was corrupted, and it kind of disappeared. But the other three, especially the Akira, but Steamrunner and Saber too, would really make up a new fleet. And it's great, just like how TNG benefited from the TMP era models, namely the Oberth and the Excelsior and the Miranda. Now DS9, the TV show, is benefiting from the movies, getting movie quality at the time CGI models. If you want to know what TV quality CGI models looked like in 1996, check out Season 3 of Ep.4, which is not bad, but not this level. And of course, these would appear in Voyager, especially the Miranda. The Akira. You can tell I've been going at this a while. And then eventually, for Eaglemoss, the models were revisited, updated. So technically, these miniatures probably have more detail than what was on the screen in '96. And that finally resurrected the Norway after years and years of waiting. So what do you think of the First Contact fleet? What's your favorite? And more importantly, because it's interesting, what's your least favorite? So while the Dominion War is mostly fought by older ships like the Galaxy, although in a refit form, the Miranda, even some Excelsiors and Ober and all that stuff, and we had the First Contact. There were a couple of kit bashes created for the show, and yeah, here they are. So the Jaeger class is a thing that exists. It's good to see more Intrepid stuff, I guess, but the idea that it's mated with the Maquis Raider hull, I mean, obviously the scales don't work out at all, but I can't help but envision this as Janeway and Chakotay's love child. That said, I'm really glad they dropped the romance plot between those two. For one, it was just too obvious, and for another, I just don't feel like those two had the same chemistry. Now, granted, it probably would have been better than the whole Chakotay 7 of 9 plot. That was strange. At least they didn't try Chakotay B'Elanna Torres romance, thank God. Now, I will say for all that, the Torres and Paris plot, perfect. Because those are the exact kind of people that really get attracted to each other in real life. Similar values, similar personality, but also they rub each other the wrong way. But they had, yeah, anyway, that was very, very believable and one of the best things about Voyager. I digress. Anyway, the Jaeger exists, and, well, Eaglemoss did the best they could with it. I mean, even the real studio model was pretty clunkily done. To be fair, this was just meant to be put in backgrounds to be different looking. So yeah, Intrepid saucer and nacelles, but instead of the gun pods on the Raider, we've got those, and then we just have this, and instead of the head, it's cut off. It's a thing, it exists, who knows, who cares. Let's move on. You know, ironically, I kind of like the Jaeger, but there's just not much to say about it. And of course, a Miranda reappears. This is actually the final kind of variant, the Antares, I think they just gave it that. We see this variant just kind of orbiting DS9, and I gotta admit, it's probably my favorite Miranda variant. I like that it kind of has the cannons on top, and I like the dish. I think of it as an AWACS dish, but you could say it's a weapons pod if you wanted. And in the show, when you see these being used as destroyers, now typically they don't have the stuff on top, but they did relight the engines. That's why in my headcanon I said they gave them new engines. I think they were, they lit these up as blue, and I think the fronts were, yellow or orange? So there were two Dominion War variants, and this is being the more physically distinctive. And this was the last one that Eaglemoss gave us, meaning I think we have 5 Miranda variants. The Soyuz, the original, of course. We have, 6, I think, if we count the prototype. And of course, we have the Lantry. We have the Saratoga. And what's neat is they didn't just take the same saucer and everything and just no, if you put them side by side, you'll see that some have slightly larger and slightly smaller saucers. Each one is its own mold, including this. But this was the last one released. Was it issue 150? I feel like it was one of those even numbers. It's kind of, it's a Miranda, what more can I say? This one sits pretty loose on its stand, but then most Mirandas do. Sometimes I'll even put just a teeny bit of blue tack in the clip. I'll get on there, we go. Because it just wants to wiggle wobble side to side. But oh well, they didn't have a lot of mounting options. Now, ironically, the next ship was created for the Dominion War, but didn't appear in DS9. Created for the Voyager episode Ship in a Bottle, because someone thought it'd be a good idea to have Andy Dick on the show, the Prometheus class, USS Prometheus. I have feelings about this ship. The design, I like. I like quad nacelles, and we haven't been seeing many of them lately, so huzzah! And the blended star drive and hull and everything fits in very, very well, and it makes perfect sense that Starfleet would be looking for a medium combat cruiser, because they've got some small ones, the Sabre and the Defiant, namely. Even some light cruisers, Steam Runner and all that. But yeah, something that kind of complement the Akira makes sense. So I like the design. And Eaglemoss did a really good job. All metal here, except for till you get to the nacelles. So it's got some good weight. They did an XL version of this. I never picked it up. I like the design. I don't love it enough to pay the XL prices. Of course, my main complaint is the combat separation, the multi-vector assault mode thingamajig, where it splits into not 2 but 3 ships. It's dumb. I'm sorry, it's dumb. Everyone knows it's dumb. You have to have 3 of everything. 3 warp cores, 3 da. And what's it do you? I mean, having 3 smaller, weaker ships attacking you versus 1 heavier ship that can support itself in space, it just would not matter. It's the same reason that fighters are of limited use in Star Trek, but it's more the rule of cool. I get it. They needed to think of some reason. You know, the Defiant had a blade of armor and quantum torpedoes and pulse phasers. What could they do as the next warship step forward? And that was the Prometheus. And we do know that they put these into full production because we see them later in the show, but actually you saw an Enterprise in a future sense, but probably didn't have many by the end of the Dominion War. Yeah, the multi-vector assault mode is doofy, but everything else is cool about it, and it's definitely become a fan favorite, and it's really good that we have the 4 nacelle vessel again. I'll be honest, that's actually what kind of got me to like some of the Discovery era ships, like the Europa. I don't know, they're just unique. I like the Constellation class as well. Neat ship, had to be done. Was done pretty early in the series. Yeah, sometimes they just plug in. I need to blue tack that one, I think. Anyway, let's move on. Post-Dominion warships. And this one I probably should have put in video 5, which is going to be a more speculative future ships, alternative ships, but I really like it, and I'm sure they made it. The Rhode Island class based on the Nova. I would show you the bottom, but the bottoms look exactly the same. This was a quick rework of the VFX model for the end of Voyager. In fact, they were just going to reuse the Nova, which, to be fair, was a new model at the time still. But unpaid overtime labor, I think it was John Eves or his team, gave this a face-over for Harry Kim. The main thing is the new saucer with the bridge dome and the filled-in front section. Also, the nacelles are a little different, and the back engines are a little different. It's distinct enough. I'm not sure if you'd really call it a refit or just, similar base hull. But yeah, this would be based on it. Bit of a kit bash, but it works, and it explains why this seems to have a lot better combat capabilities than the original USS Equinox when we see it. If they just reused the Nova straight up, it would have seemed OP in in-game, but technically this is a different ship class, not to mention also in the future, so yeah, it works. Then again, the Klingon ships are in the future too, so you'd expect them to kind of keep parity. Between the two designs, I think the Nova is more distinctive and interesting. I think the Rhode Island looks better. Even if it's a little more conservative, it's a little sleeker, a little smoother, a little bit nicer. And this was done in the standard series. This wasn't a special or anything. Like I said, it's a fan favorite design. Plus, hey, it's Captain Harry Kim's ship. So, what a wasted character and actor, frankly, on the show. He was Mayweather before Mayweather was Mayweather. What else? The quote-unquote mission scout ship from Insurrection. This is the one that Data flew. This is, almost easily a shuttle, but since we see it on its own on that planet, it's considered a ship. It really is the smallest ship. It definitely reminds me of the Defiant. Meets Runabout. Also has a lot of resemblance to the Type 11 shuttle. It's fine. I don't really have a lot of feelings about it. It's a shuttle to me. But I will say Eaglemoss did a good job. Metal, some plastic on the undersides of the nacelles. Good size. Would I have wanted them to do this in a shuttle pack? Probably not. It is considered to be its own starship, even if it's really the smallest they do. Basically, kind of like a PT boat in World War II. PT boats were basically as small as a skiff from large ships, but they did operate independently, and that's what this is. Oh, I do think it's neat that it has the docking hatch built in. And if you have the Eaglemoss Type 11 shuttle, they actually do mate up. And it makes sense, considering how useful the runabout was to DS9, that in universe they would kind of bump it up just a notch, make it a little more independent, a little more survivable, and go with that. So yeah, not a whole lot to say about it. I'm glad it was a new design for the show, and a couple of action scenes there. We saw it had decent combat capabilities, post-Dominion Warfleet. Moving right along, a vessel we actually looked at pretty recently when I looked at the lower decks. The Luna class USS Titan. This is the original small scale that Eaglemoss did as a bonus, because when they did it, this was not technically a canon ship, but it was as canon as a beta canon could be, because Riker's ship, the Titan, was mentioned at the end of Nemesis. It had been mentioned in books, and it, was known to exist. It's just its exact shape. But of course, this was designed in a competition and was the winner on the book jacket. And I think it was a good tribute to the artist who made it and to the whole Titan book series that Lower Decks finally canonized it and pretty much did it exactly as depicted, although changed a little bit for the cartoon, the animated nature. It's a pretty conventional design. As I said earlier with the concept Voyager, I do like the underslung nacelle look. More traditional starter. It's a traditional, but I also like that it has a pod. This seems like a good medium cruiser complement to the Sovereign, kind of like the Nebula and Galaxy. It's not revolutionary like when the Defiant came out, but it fits into the fleet. Again, good fan design. I think it has a lot of elements of Sovereign and the Miranda and the Nebula. You can tell where he drew from, but they blend together well. And Eaglemoss did a good job with this originally. It's got decent weight, and the fact that it was really one of the first, maybe the first, actualized 3D model. And then again, in a recent video, I talked about the larger version done for the Lower Decks collection, and I talked more about the competition. So I'm just going to breeze past it here. But if you're interested, check out my recent Lower Decks video. Here's another one that has had an interesting canon history, the USS Dauntless, the Dauntless class. This, of course, was from Voyager when it was a fake Starfleet ship. But I always thought the design was neat, and obviously it was convincing enough as a human ship to pass Voyager's muster. Then again, these are the people that have the infinite shuttle bay and never question it. Do you think Voyager's actually a TARDIS? But yeah, I like how they changed the deflector quite a bit to indicate the transwarp, or excuse me, the slipstream is now it's called. It has the underslung nacelles that we're seeing on some newer ships. And they're Starfleet-esque, but also different. Yeah, it does a good job of doing the same but different approach, if I'm being honest. And I really enjoyed the concave saucer, and I'm using saucer in quotes even though it's a triangle. This seems kind of like the ultimate culmination. And if you want to be in universe, Arcturus is kind of only knowing the Voyager, you could see where he would kind of make this the ultimate evolution. But of course, this was made canon in the sense of Starfleet with Prodigy. Yes, I know the Prodigy version is different, especially in the back, but unfortunately, by the time that came out, Eaglemoss was gone. They never did a single Prodigy ship, not even the Protostar. Maybe one day someone will. But in the interim, this is a good stand-in. And we actually do see this model reused in the future scene in Enterprise, so we can say that Starfleet definitely made these. Maybe the Dauntless prototype was different, but the production model was more like this. And we know that they could because we saw in Season 5 the Voyager crew replicating the quantum slipstream drive. So if they could make the drive on their own, why couldn't Utopia Planitia make the ship? And they had plenty of time to scan it. Eaglemoss did a good job. It's, small and slim, but so is the ship in the show. Top is metal, bottom is plastic. So it's not light, not heavy, in between. And this is one, I've said in many videos, I wish I had more of a rake. This is one where they got that rake right. I think when they're in danger of slipping off their stands, Yeah, just tilting them back is good. Plus, it means more shelf space. And as large as the collection was, that was a good thing. And our other quantum slipstream ship in the books as Redax's USS Aventine, the Vesta class. Now, this was not in the standard edition. This was a special, much like the bonus edition, much like the Titan, because it was only in books. This was meant to be a quantum slipstream ship, kind of the next step after the Dauntless, and in the books it's the 2380s, so it fits in well. And it does resemble the Sovereign quite a bit. I think I left the Sovereign over here. Yeah, so it does kind of have that next step Sovereign look. I will say though, this model is very light. The saucer is metal, the star drive is plastic, and since it's mostly star drive, well, there you go. I like it. It's fine. It doesn't really strike me one way or the other. It's just another one to the fleet. And I often do mix these up on the shelf, this Sovereign and this, to really look at the details. What do you think, though? Do you like the Vesta? Do you hope maybe someone will make it canon in lower decks as well? Let me know. And let's wrap up our small-scale ships with the Odyssey class, the Enterprise F. Another quantum slipstream ship. First from Star Trek Online, and now made canon thanks to Picard Season 3. Although the whole Enterprise F getting early retirement without explanation was kind of weird. I mean, we know the real world reason, because they wanted to make the Enterprise G. I'm not going to get into that. I enjoyed Season 3, but I had some odd choices like that. But anyway, yeah, ship. This thing is huge, but a lot of the large-scale ships in STO are big. I mean, just over 1,000 meters. It's not even close to the biggest ship we've seen in sci-fi. I mean, it's big, but a kilometer long isn't ridiculous, considering the Galaxy made decades earlier was over half that in length. The double neck is kind of neat, and the return to a Galaxy-style deflector. It is kind of like Galaxy meets Sovereign. And, you know, I probably should have put this in the video 5, but there's a reason I wanted to go ahead and include it in video 4. I thought it was a good capper for the 24th century, since according to Picard kind of pushed the timetable for the Enterprise F up, although in Picard, it seems like the Enterprise E was destroyed under Worf, so maybe that sped things up in this timeline. The model from Eaglemoss is fine. Kind of like the Vesta metal plastic, so it's a little light. And not only does this like to slip off the stand, this is actually one where they gave the wrong thing. They actually mixed up the stands, this and the Bonaventure. The stems, so I switched them around. So it sits on, but it's a little loose. It's not going to fall off on your shelf, but yeah, you can usually knock it, so be careful. I like it, but I never could or have played Star Trek Online, so I don't have a special affinity for it, and I kind of feel like Picard Season 3 did the Enterprise F a little bit dirty. But, c'est la vie. Let's go big. Also from Picard, and now going into the medium scale, we have this guy. Actually like it. What do you think? The Wallenberg tug or starship is actually named after a very honorable diplomat who saved many lives in World War II. Did a whole video on it. Also, I got this one on Christmas several years ago. But yeah, I like how they have basically a cutback saucer. Like you can see the beginnings of a saucer and even the phaser strip, and they just chopped it back because they don't need it. And then the big drives here, whether they're supposed to be tractors or just engines. And then this big pallet. This would have been a neat one if they'd made this magnetic. I know that's not what Eaglemoss does, but if someone made this but magnetic and you had detachable pods, either a habitation pod, a cargo pod, you know, this could be a lot of fun. But I've gone on record many a time saying I like background ships. This is a workaday ship in use by Starfleet, and it's great. You can see this doing a lot of rolls. And I like the model. Metal, plastic back here, good size. Not really much to say about it, but it's neat that they did background ships like this, and it's a perfectly logical member of the fleet. And the same goes for the Kali class. The Cerritos lower deck. Now this is the only XL version I've shown in these videos because I didn't get the standard. I would honestly prefer the standard, but the way distribution happened with Eaglemoss closing, I was just happy to get this. It is heavy. Very heavy. This is metal. Part of the top is plastic, but it's a very heavy thing. And the whole idea of this being a second contact ship, an engineering ship, or variants being medical ships, just a multi-purpose ship. No one knows exactly when the Kali class came in, but it seems to go back to around the Galaxy time. Some have said pre-Galaxy, and the interiors definitely resemble Galaxy, but it looks to me to be either contemporary or right after the Galaxy. And the saucer is kind of it's an interesting thing. My only thing I don't really care for are the Bussard collectors. They look like little deflector dishes. I think a more conventional collector would have been my taste. But everything else I like. The spindly nature makes sense for an engineering ship. In some small way, it kind of reminds me of the Oberth, which again was a science engineering type ship too. So, yeah. Yeah. My only complaint here is I just wish I'd had the standard version, not the XL, but at least I got the XL and I didn't pay crazy money for them. I paid, I think, $59. Ironically, the standard version was more because it was from Master Replicas. This came out right at the end of Eaglemoss. In fact, I think this was the only lower deck ship they released. My only complaint about the XLs from Eaglemoss, they're a good size, but they use the same base as everyone else, and they're all kind of wobbly. And this one's especially bad because it's so heavy. And not all the XLs are as heavy. But it's a good size ship. It's all spread out. But yeah, I think it fits well into the fleet as just a service ship. And of course that goes the same for the Parliament class, or as I like to think of it, the Canada class, the Vancouver. So this is the standard size for the lower decks collection. And I like it. It's a good size. It's a good in-between. Now this one is, as much as I thought the Cerritos, either version, is kind of heavy, this one's pretty light. It's metal, but I think it's just such a thin ship. Yeah, even the hull, the little deflector is metal, but it just seems like it's a thinner module. So it's just a little lighter ship. It too is an engineering ship, and it looks it. It doesn't look like the Wallenberg, but somehow it does kind of remind me of the Wallenberg. I don't know why, but it kind of does. But it also reminds me of some of the disco ships. I think it fits in just fine. I wouldn't want this as a hero ship. It's a little too plain, but as a background ship, a companion ship, it fits in great. It also kind of reminds me of a slightly updated like Lantry style Miranda. But Eaglemoss did a good job. The only thing, like I said, it does surprise me that it's a little light, but that's okay. They build them kind of how the design demands. And we end this section, same as the last, with the copy-paste fleet. Now, Eaglemoss's part, they did a great job. They actually have more detail in their models than was on screen. And whereas with the First Contact fleet, you have the excuse of 1990 CGI, the excuse for Picard Season 1 was they were out of money. It was actually a minor miracle they had this ship at all. It was actually an older John Eves design made for a video game that was updated. And they gave 4 variants in total, 2 different colors and 2 different nacelles. And I don't mind it. I actually like the design. But having 200 copy-paste, if they couldn't have 200 unique ships, that's fine. Just have It doesn't. No one said Riker's fleet had to be huge. In fact, why was it? Just have a dozen of these, or even, put in some older models and make 6 of these. I mean, duplicates are fine. There were like 4 Nebulas at Wolf 359, so okay. And if you want to say this was designed for mass production, kind of like the Saber, and when we saw literally entire wings of Sabers, that's cool too. But, yeah. Anyway, the design itself I do like. Both the engine variants are kind of cool. I like these angular engines. I think they look neat. And the kind of angular but smooth hull gives it a new generation feel. Not next generation, but new. And the one area that a lot of people criticize, and I get it, is the deflector. Now, first off, I've always thought, and I think it's been confirmed now, this is not a shuttle bay. It definitely looks like their attempt to get away from deflectors. And deflectors have changed a lot over the years. It's kind of a grill style. And for a combat vessel, that actually kind of makes sense. But the reason I say I think a lot of people agree with me is because when you look at Picard Season 2, we do see some Inquiry classes, but they have a more standard, more conventional deflector put on. And the model itself was updated. Shoot, the CGA models were so hastily done in Picard that they didn't even have the names on them. Okay. So really the only difference here is this. Now, to Eaglemoss's credit, only the Zinghi was part of the standard collection, and then the Toussaint was a gift, and then the Varian Fry and the Mahi were bonus editions. So there's only one of these in the normal collection, but for completists, they did do all 4 variants. And I eventually picked them up. I got all of mine cheap, so why not? In fact, my very final order from Eaglemoss themselves was the Mahi and the Varian Fry. The Toussaint I actually got from Mastercraft when they put them up. Not this last time, but times ago. But I like the design. I just they just shouldn't. If they hadn't copy pasted it, if they'd had a more traditional fleet, I think it would have been better received, because we do see variants of this on Star Trek Online and people like them. The deflector is an interesting thing, but I like these nacelles. They remind me of cigars. Yeah, I like it, and Eaglemoss did a good job. Oh, and I do like the forward swept nacelle pipe. We've had so many pylons that are swept back. It's nice to kind of go back to the Galaxy style forward sweep. And this does look like a combat vessel to me. A little bit of Nova in the front here, the way it's done. And the weight's good. This is metal. It turns into plastic. This is metal back here. It turns into plastic when you get to the pylons. So metal, plastic, and then that's plastic down there. So pretty good weight to it. More than the Vancouver, but not the heaviest we've got. I think they did the absolute... You can tell Eaglemoss took a lot of care doing this one. And of the Picard series, the Universe series, which wasn't all that popular with a lot of people, this was one of the ships that sold better. I think the Romulan Bird of Prey sold the best. But then there were the interesting Romulan ships from Picard that, well, I've done videos. So what do you think? Going from right after Wolf 359, leading right into the 25th century with the Odyssey class. Let's bring this home. And there we have it. I do have a few more ships to talk about. So I guess there's going to be a 5th video, but I think it will be shorter. Call it a bonus video. This one really wraps up the main on-screen live-action canon ships. But we have a few more to talk about. But that'll be next time. A little bonus stuff, why not? So what do you think? Do you like the anti-Borg fleet? Or do you like the post-war fleet of exploration? Or maybe you found the Inquiry class interesting. I have mixed feelings, as you've heard. Oh well, still happy to have them. And I'm happy Eaglemoss was able to make the variants before they weren't able to make anything at all. But yeah, let me know what you think. As I said with the other videos, once I'm done making the individuals, I'll make a supercut version of this as well. So check that out eventually. Give me a little time to rest and we'll wrap up with Episode 5 in the Starfleet Federation Starships. The complete, frankly, history. At least 300 years of it. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.